Behind the Bulb is a deep dive into the ideas and industries of our world. Have you ever looked at a structure and asked, whatever happened to the people that built this? What motivated those people to wake up in the morning and head off to work? No matter the occupation, these are real questions. But simply, why do we do what we do? This season, we focus on the building industry. We know the basic principles of how things are built, but we often don't know the narratives of the people involved in building them. Lend us your ears as we unfold their journey. Whether you are a part of the building industry or not, we think you will enjoy listening to these inspiring stories. Welcome to Behind the Bulb. I'm Brendan McCartney.
And I'm James Young.
On this episode, we have Landon Roberts, who works in Los Angeles, California as a lighting designer. What does that even mean? What was your first experience with lighting? These are things Landon shares with us. He talks about his first memories of light. He talks about a road trip from the East Coast to the West Coast and how he ultimately ended up in Los Angeles. We talk about pediatric cancer awareness and how this is a motivating factor for him, not only in his career development, but for his personal development and some of his own personal relationships, and how they have been major factors on his progress in life. We think this is very important, and we enjoy listening to what Landon has to say.
Let's roll.
So we're so stoked to have Landon Roberts here. And as Twitter reads, designer, CrossFit, coffee addict, explorer, news junkie, Penn State grad. What we really want to know, Landon, is what did you have for breakfast today?
I actually didn't have anything for breakfast. I don't know what itch I got during this whole quarantine COVID thing, but I decided it would be smart to try intermittent fasting, which if there's anybody in the world that's never going to be able to pull it off, it's me, because I can't stop eating. But I figured, well, what the heck? Why not? I'll try it.
Somebody who doesn't eat breakfast is clearly running around and working a ton, right?
Yes. Yeah. I do miss it. It's definitely like my favorite.
It's pastime.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
Pre-COVID.
Definitely a pastime. One of my favorites, that's for sure.
BC. So we are thinking about here is, all right, we got crazy times right now going on. And there's a whole community of people who are building buildings and designing buildings. From our understanding, you're a part of this community. You mind explaining a little bit about that and what it is you do and you have found yourself doing over the past 5-10 years?
Over the past 5 or 10 years, I've specialized in lighting design. I still haven't figured out what I want to do when I grow up, but for the past decade or so, I've been doing that. I'm just one little sort of piece in the puzzle of the building industry. And it's always a wild ride, working with different project teams, kind of like back in school or in college where you're in different teams and in a class to do build a project, or maybe not build, but do a project for the class. And the group of people changes in each class, just like the group of people changes on each project. Working with engineers, architects, owners, homeowners.
I want to stop you real quick there. So you mentioned something back in school. I always remember like you sitting in a group of desks, right, in 8th grade or something, and it's like, who's going to be the facilitator, who's going to be the presenter, and who's going to be this, right? Yeah. Who were you?
I think I was the one that kind of like held back a little bit and tried to like feel out what each person on the team's like skill set was. And then I would jump in and say, all right, you're the one that's going to manage the team, and you're the one that's going to present, and you're the one that's going to do all the technical research, and you're the one that's going to herd all the cats.
A true consultant.
Yes. Figuring out who's good at what, and then like, getting them on that, making sure they're doing that. There's always oh man, they didn't pull their weight, or oh, that guy could have done a much better job at presenting, and he, totally, crashed and burned doing this and that. And like, all right, let's just figure out who's good at what, and then let's make them do it. Every team's different, and figuring out like, how lighting plays a part in the puzzle in each project. Sometimes it's really fun because we can play center stage. Sometimes it's just make it work and move on. So trying to figure out how that all, what role you play on each project is kind of an interesting exercise.
Do you ever stop maybe it's a very high profile project, a lot of space, a lot of square footage, a lot of pressure. And before the project starts, you're looking at it and you go, how is this thing going to get built with the personalities and all the politics?
Single time. Every single time. And, I think that then begs the question of like, well, then what's my role in the project? And I think each project is different in that sense. And, it's kind of a fun exercise because as I started to develop in my career, I started to like learn a lot more about each project and how unique each project was. And so every time I attacked a project at the beginning, I kind of looked at it as like determining what sort of tools in your toolbox and your toolkit that you needed to pull out for this project. And every project was different. You have projects that are super high profile, or, a multifamily home, or a high profile museum, or an airport project, right? And so it kind of makes it interesting because you have to look at each project differently, and it just kind of keeps you on your toes. Otherwise it gets boring. Otherwise it's like, well, all right, I'll just pull out the hammer, pull out the nails, and let's just get at it.
Right. So you said something that was interesting. You said you were new to the industry and you were running around and doing everything. At what point did you realize I am spread tooth? I'm helping out with marketing, or I'm helping out with this. Meanwhile, I'm this, right? Where you're like, I've had 5 cups of coffee today. It's 10 p.m. I'm sending out an email, and the person's responding or thinking, why is this person sending me a 10 p.m. email or something along those lines?
Part of it was just me growing up. Part of it was having the right mentors that knew when to tell me to pump the brakes. And part of it was being given sort of the space to kind of crash and burn on my own. And you kind of can't spread yourself too thin, and learning how to take your passions and your hobbies and kind of find a way to kind of blend them a little bit to keep your sanity was really an important learning experience for me.
You've mentioned growing up twice now, right?
Yeah.
You said, when I grow up, and you said, when I grew up. So how was it actually growing up?
Yeah.
Right?
I'll let you know.
Yeah. Where are you? You're from Pennsylvania.
I am. I'm from the suburbs of Philadelphia, born and raised. Wow. Yeah, so it's a little different than Los Angeles. That's for sure.
Do you remember your first interaction with lighting?
I think my earliest memory of lighting was being afraid of the dark. I think that would probably be one thing. And I think like trying to think back on memories of light and being a kid, I think fireflies was the other thing. I think you could relate a little bit to that. The curiosity of seeing this bug flying, well, not seeing it really, but all of a sudden just seeing this like flash of like brief little like pinpoint flash of light in the middle of space at night, and being fascinated by something that could emit light from its body. I think that was one of the first memories I had of light. I don't get that here. I miss that.
Do you feel like you try to apply that? Because you said something really interesting. You said for my body to emit light, and albeit humans can't do that per se, right? But in your work, you can bring light to people.
I think for me, what got me into lighting was partially the inability to really like hone in my interests, because I had such a broad spectrum of interests. But landing in lighting, because I found it was a great sort of combination of interests that I had that kind of were all over the spectrum. So business being part of it, creativity and sort of art and outside the box thinking, a level of technicality as well, having to take all these dang like structural engineering courses and engineering mechanics courses of how do you make and physics and how do you make buildings stand up and how do you do all that sort of thing. And then even getting into lighting and how do you direct light? How do you explain to somebody that you can't bend the laws of physics and have light kind of like go around a circle or something like that? but also being able to have that impact. I think that might be one of the biggest sort of like that may have been one of the biggest draws for me, was the impact on the human psyche and the way that you perceive light and don't even realize it, which I thought was really fascinating. I mean, colored lights like are great. Like you can see it changing colors and that's fun. But the subtle ways that you can use light to make somebody feel something in a space, I thought was really fascinating. So there was that like, human aspect of it, that human psychological aspect of it, almost like psychology, right? And how each space is completely different, right? And going back to that discussion we just had about like the project teams in high school and in college, where in each class you have a different group of people that think different ways, right? And the same way in projects, right? Where an architect envisions a space completely differently than the next architect. And how do you evoke similar things, but doing it with a different set of skills or set of tools? Makes it kind of an interesting sort of experience that, you can't really get in this rut of thinking. You have to think differently every single time.
Is it important to you that your work is impactful?
I think it is. I mean, going back to what we were talking about before, where I was saying how at the beginning of my career, like I was just developing this and that, and I was doing a lot of heavy lifting. It was sort of an opportunity for me to better understand what kind of impact you were having, right? And then I went through a part of my career where I was working a lot in single family homes. And right before I had hopped into that career, that job, with that company, I wouldn't get close to any residential project, like with the 20-foot pole. Like I was like, you just keep that away from me. I had a horrible experience with a residential client, and it was, looking back, a really good experience because it really challenged my way of thinking. It really forced me to think outside the box. But working in this residential setting, we had this interesting spectrum that I learned about, where you had people that want to walk around their house with a candle, essentially. They could care less if it was pitch black. I'm like, you're crazy. If you fall, you're going to crack your head open. Or if your child falls, they're going to like fall into the pool and they can't even swim. And then you have this other person on the other side of the spectrum that wants Los Angeles, like LAX in their backyard. I'm like, you do realize that the amount of light that your property is going to emit is probably more than all of the residential neighborhoods in Los Angeles combined. And so learning how people interpret light, right? And a lot of the times, if you have a husband and wife homeowner, a lot of the times one of them interprets light way differently than the other. And so how do you navigate that conversation without them getting divorced before the end of the project? But
Have you had that happen?
No, luckily, knock on wood. But how do you, navigate those conversations? And it's almost sort of like a psychologist of like, how do you work through this? How do you want to light your bedroom? How do you want to light your kitchen?
Did you have to navigate, like, I'm going to side more with the husband today, or I'm going to side more with, the wife today? Like, you had to.
A lot of the times one person actually cared more than the other about how it was lit, but they interpreted it differently. And so having the conversations with both of them, so that at the end of the day, they walk into their home, they're like, what did you do? Right? Making sure that didn't happen and saying, okay, this is what we think we should do. And we can address both of your concerns by doing this. Right. And so learning a lot about how they respond to light was really fascinating, because a lot of the times homeowners versus architects, homeowners don't have that technical depth to the way that they experience light. And so they can only explain it to you based on how they feel and what they see. And being able to achieve that, the end product, when you hand that house over to them, is so fascinating and is so heartwarming, because you can see them walk into the space for the first time and their mouth just drops and they can't stop talking about it. We had this one client once where they're like, are you sure about X, Y, and Z? And we're like, yes, I promise you it's worth it. Like, believe in us. At the end of the day, we promise you, based on what we've learned about you and how you respond to light, that you're really going to lean into this.
So So when you present to them X, Y, and Z, so here you are working day in and day out on X, Y, and Z, and you're formulating this solution, right, for them that's going to achieve the look, right, and the feel of their space, which is so personal. It's sensitive. It's
so personal.
And it's like, we're going to go there. We're going to have this conversation. Yeah. We're going to talk about warm lighting, cool lighting, right? We start using their terms. So when you get into that space and you're developing X, Y, and Z, is there a moment where you think you have an inspiration, or that it kind of can go two ways, right? I'm inspired by this person or this event for my creativity, and I'm inspired by this person or event for my work ethic, right? There's like these two different variables. But I'm curious, what is it that inspires you as you're developing X, Y, and Z, which might be, I'm going to select a particular fixture or product for them. But in other instances, I'm going to go in a different direction, which is a little bit, maybe it's not typical, but I know them. Yeah. And then they say, Landon, we really want you to be creative. And we believe in you as a designer. What do you bring with you from your past?
That's an interesting question. I think what's challenging for lighting designers versus an architect, not to say an architect's job isn't challenging, it is, and probably more so than a lighting designer's than mine. But the one thing that I think is hard for lighting designers that actually architects a lot of the times don't understand is that an architect tends to back into, whether it's intentional or not, some sort of style, right? They're a modernist architect. They're a traditional architect, like, Frank Gehry. You tend to be able to say, oh, that's a Frank Gehry building, right? Or, oh, that's a Richard Meier building, or that's a Zumthor building, or something like that. Because you can start to pick out very like specific vocabulary that they've established as sort of their iconic style, right? With lighting designers, we don't really have that luxury of saying, oh, well, I'm just going to do a modern style. We tend to work with architects that work in all sort of areas. And so to me, the built environment is all about how you feel in a fabricated man-made space, right? And it can be as natural or unnatural as you want it. It can be as modern or traditional or whatever as you want it. But how do you support that architecture? And so it's hard because sometimes I find myself personally like leaning towards a certain style, but I have to pull that back when an architect wants to go in a different direction, and when they can articulate to me what they want to create and what feelings they want to evoke. That's how I then am able to go back to my toolbox and say, okay, that's what you want to do. And so I think for me, what my inspiration, I think, comes from that collaborative experience and that team experience, right? And going back to that like school experience of, what is it that we're trying to create at the end of the day? And then what does each person bring to the table? And then kind of coming in and helping to enhance that, I think. I think part of it's the consultant mindset, part of it's like the project management, but part of it's really, I think, just how do you see that built environment and how do you want that to feel at the end of the day?
And what you're talking about, right? It's a human reaction, like a real feeling.
A real feeling.
And that impact and experience and human quality of your creativity and your work ethic, right? Because they really kind of in a way go hand in hand. There's moments you want to walk away, but you can't. And it's like, we got to go through and push forward. And in the 11th hour, you come up with a fantastic idea. But that human experience, would you say some of your experiences? I look at your Twitter, right? Your Twitter headline says designer, CrossFit, coffee addict, explorer, news junkie, Penn State grad, hashtag FTK. What I find fascinating about that, I'm looking at this headline and I go, CrossFit. Some would say that's extreme. Coffee addict. Right? Well, America loves and runs on coffee, right? You got explorer, right? So willing to go to new heights. News junkie. These days particularly, right? But then it finishes with hashtag FTK. And people who are not familiar with, right, is a wonderful, it's a kind of a tip of the hat to an incredible experience that's happening across the country. And you talk about impact and experience.
Yeah.
That right there says it all. I mean, it's an incredible impact.
Yeah.
So I wonder, does that have, is there moments where maybe you feel tired, overworked, that this sometimes comes into play? It's like, and if you don't mind explaining, hashtag FTK.
Sure. Yeah. I think if you go back to my childhood, there's very few experiences that I would say have like left lifetime marks on me, like single marks or single events. But one of them was a dear friend of mine when I was in high school who passed away from cancer. And that at that point, I think that was the first person that I'd known in my life that had died. And she was a good friend of mine and a group of friends of mine. And that kind of like, you know, caused me to head dive into this whole cause of supporting pediatric cancer awareness, pediatric cancer research. And I just so happened to go to a university back on the East Coast that was really big into that as well. And so that kind of fueled a lot of the fire in me that I have today of being able to live a life that at the end of the day, I could go back and say, I think I did it right. And I don't have any regrets. So for the kids, hashtag FTK, for the kids, has always been a motto that I've lived by and a person who has always kind of stuck with me since my teenage years, I guess. And so I kind of on the side of my job started a nonprofit in Los Angeles, and my friends in New York and Washington, D.C. had started a similar thing in those respective cities. And so I was like, well, shoot, like if they can do it in New York and if they can do it in D.C., why can't I do it in the entertainment capital of the world? So over like a 5 or 6 year period, a group of friends of mine and I kind of started this whole thing, and we had a blast, and we wanted to show Los Angeles that you could have fun and you could make a difference and not break the bank all at the same time. And so we figured, why not? Let's just do it. And so that's always been a big part of my childhood. And maybe that's been a huge driver for me.
The experiences, it's, you know, you grow up, things happen, not sure why they're happening, you question, and life goes on, and there you are at the bonfire at the beach with your buddies or something. And then you're going to college and life is kind of just progressing. Then you start to work, right? And you choose a path and you make a decision to love what it is that you do. And there's qualities of it are beautiful, and you proceed down that path. And then it's kind of these residual effects that come back to you from your past. And it's hard to pinpoint whether or not they're actually affecting you as you work, as you create. Thanks for sharing that. That's pretty powerful. Similarly, as a young kid, I was young. I was 8. We were part of a friend group, you know, children ranging from like 12 to 6, and I was on the lower side. And there was a friend of mine. She was 9, and she passed away from cancer as well, from leukemia, and from a blood disorder, which inspired me, whether I knew it or not at the time. But there was a residual effect, you know, as you move forward. And it's fascinating to me that you reflect upon the firefly when you talk about lighting, an evocative, impactful experience, and you bring it with 110%. And I think a lot of people have experiences like this, whether it be directly within their own body or with a friend, a dear one who's taught them indirectly. It's a powerful thing. And you think about lighting in general, the quality of it and what it brings to people's lives. You know, I can imagine when you're working in that team environment with the facilitator, right? At least in the, you know, corporate, in the world we know today, right? Not around the table, 8th grade, talking about Edgar Allan Poe. We're talking about, you know, a 30-story building, right? And we all are sitting around the table and we have those experiences. And we all bring them to that table, and some derail the whole thing. because they've been rough experiences. What's amazing is that you've learned how to walk in another's shoes, and you can see it that way, and you don't take life for granted.
Being able to, I think, look at forks in the road and decisions that I have to make and understanding what the long-term impacts are of each of those decisions. I certainly don't make the right one every time. I'll be totally honest. But it's helped me to kind of take a little bit longer, maybe of a pause, and to think about that and to give that decision the time that it needs to make that decision.
You know, you talk about pause, and I'm thinking about, in a composition, you have a music composition, you have rests, which are a beautiful tool for a composer of silence. And a lot of times just in conversation, you hear people talking and they want to fill the conversation, fill, no gaps, and we'll throw the rest in there. And in a similar way, your first experience of light is the absence of light with darkness, nighttime, right? And when people say, well, I want color changing light in here, but can it do black lighting? And you're like, yeah, okay, that's the absence of light. Yes, we can do that. Talk to me a little bit about that. How do you use that concept of rest, of darkness? There's a beautiful symmetry there's darkness in life.
Yeah.
And oftentimes it is our first experience.
Yeah.
Is the lack of light.
Yeah. And I think that being able to speak lighting and understanding your audience is really important. It's a fascinating discussion to have with each person. And it's sort of a way to get to know them and get to know the project and get to know the uniqueness of the project. I think what's beautiful about the light and the absence of light is that it gives it the dimension of the space, right? When you look at even this wall, for example, right? Like if this was a flat wall, the whole thing would have an even gradient from the center of the wall to the ceiling and the center of the wall to the floor. But with that three-dimensional texture, it brings so much more interest and life and like dimension and quality to the wall surface.
Would you say the same about people?
I think it absolutely would. Yeah. I mean, it gives a dimension to a person that's different from every person, right? I mean, going back to that spectrum I was just talking about earlier, who you have one person that wants LAX in their backyard and you have the other person that wants to walk around their house with candlelight. Like you just have a totally different spectrum. And when you have those people in that spectrum, you can do so many more things, right? It's not just the same, okay, let's just put a table lamp by your bed and let's just call it a day, right? You have people that want table lamps, then they want downlights, then they want 3 layers of coves, right? And then they want to make their shades like lit up at night, right? And I'm like, wow, like these guys just want to go over the top. And so I think knowing your audience and then being able to navigate the conversation and put the right bumpers on the conversation, you could help to guide it. But at the end of the day, you just want to make sure that your client's happy at the end of the day, right? And I think that's okay to have LAX in your backyard, just figuring out ways to tastefully pull that off. Right. So you don't have like 8, 1,000-watt, floodlights in your backyard. Let's just do it a little bit more tastefully. And so being able to try, like, it's really fun to watch somebody in that like journey of learning that process, right? And
that journey is really fascinating.
Yeah.
They go through in a way from the dark to the light in terms of their knowledge and understanding, but it's also requiring their vulnerability to accept the fact they don't perhaps know anything about the subject that you're now teaching them and hired to propose a solution for. And it's interesting, right? What we're really in some ways talking about a business transaction, right? They have hired person X to come in, consult, and give us a lighting solution. But through that process, because lighting is so intimate, they are willing, in a way, the client can be open to the fact that they don't know much and are willing to learn, or they're going to totally rely on you and borders up.
Oh yeah,
you do it.
Yeah,
and I'll see you in 2 months. And when I walk in and turn the lights on, and I'm like, not what I like. And it's like, hold on, we didn't communicate. So there's a relationship that gets established there and requires vulnerability, and it's beautifully tied to this concept of darkness and light.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think being able to have that direct connection is really important, but it can be tough. Yeah. It can be interesting. You deal with all sorts of interesting personalities. All sorts of interesting personalities.
And then there's the times you might have your own identity crisis in the middle of it all, right? That you're handling.
Do I know what I'm talking about? Oh my goodness. Yes.
Gosh. Yeah. So it's 10 p.m., right? You've been working on this project too much and you're not docking the time. You know, it's like, I'm going to go over the top. Your eyes are bloodshot. You have too much coffee, whatever it may be. And you already did your CrossFit for the day. So you're super exhausted. What is it, your workmanship? What is it that...
What keeps you going? What gets you through those like burning hours?
Because there's these and those residual effects, right? You know, and the process that you've gone through in your life, right? The life process. Yeah. We may not know what it is at that time, but I'm curious if there's something you think is impacting you.
I think there's a lot of factors that go into that. I think part of it could be my personal issue with perfectionism. Part of it is the seasoned sort of experience that you develop over time of, is the ROI worth it? Is that extra time worth it? And is it an architect that really is relying on you to produce a certain thing at the end of the day? Is it a client who really understands lighting, that it's really important to them and they really want it to be perfect, and you feel the need to make sure that that's executed at the best of your ability? I think that, and maybe this is a whole different conversation, but it's also the reliance on the contractor to be able to build that at the end of the day too, because you can design till you're blue in the face, but if you've got a 2-year-old building your building, that sure is not going to be looking the same as you think it's going to be. But I think part of it's that. I think part of it's just your life, your work-life balance. It's really important. Part of it's, I think, working on projects that you know are worth putting in those hours to put in, that you know the client will be really happy, you know the architect will be really happy, you know that will be executed properly, is also a piece of it. But I think even to get through my program in college, that was brutal. It was a 5-year program and all my friends were out having fun across the street, and you could hear them while you're in the building doing your thesis project. I'm like, yeah, what am I doing? Why am I doing this?
That abstract is still online, by the way.
Yeah.
Yeah. 110,000 square foot building.
Yeah.
Pretty cool.
Yeah.
But those are the tough choices, right?
Yeah, they are.
But everybody's partying across the street. These, and there's that moment. And when you're in that moment, it's like 2 parts of the brain. One part, I'm a loser.
Yeah.
The other part's like, screw them.
Yeah.
I'm more successful than them.
Yeah. Successful in air quotes.
Yeah, yes,
right. Yeah.
And then they went into finance and made
yes,
a ton of money. Right?
And now they're retired. I'm like, great. What was I doing? I still have to figure out what I want to do when I grow up.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
Well, Landon, do you have any last words before you fade to the black here?
Yeah, right. I think I think to answer your question, I think, to be honest, if there's one thing that gets me through those late nights, it's the people you work with. It's the clients you work for. If you work with people that you enjoy working with, if you work on projects, if you work on things that you enjoy working on, that at the end of the day is going to get you through the midnight hour. It's going to get you through burning, the candle at both ends. Working with people that respect you, that will challenge you when you need to be challenged, that will be receptive to when you're challenging them when they need to be challenged, to be able to continually learn. I think that the design industry, or not the design, the building industry is always a learning process, and you build a project and it was good. but you've always room for improvement. And I think knowing that, allowing that, and not having to worry about it being 200% perfect, but knowing that you can always do a little bit better the next time is always a fun process, and I don't want to stop learning. And I think that's a piece of it too, right? Of being able to continue to learn and being open to new ways of thinking, being open to different cultures, of thinking different ways, of going about it in different ways than you would typically. That's always been something that's kept me going. So
Landon Roberts, a man with a moral compass. It's important that the people you work for, that they have a code of ethics, they follow a certain way.
Yeah, it is.
Because it's the human interaction.
Mm-hmm.
The human end of the day. Part of it all that makes the most sense.
Yeah.
Thanks for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
Appreciate it, Landon.
Absolutely.
And that's it for this week's episode. Thank you for your time. Thanks for listening. And if you could, please subscribe and share with your family and friends. Here's a sneak peek into next week's episode. And you made your way out to Colorado. So did you go to high school in Syracuse area?
So actually, when I was in high school, my dad changed jobs, and we ended up down in the Charlotte, North Carolina area. So I was in the Syracuse area until high school, and then we moved down there. So that was also a reason why I wanted to move to Colorado, because South Carolina, North Carolina doesn't have a ton of snowboarding, and that was kind of what I loved then and still do. And so when it was time to look for colleges, I was like, all right, where are the biggest mountains in the country? Those are my options. So, yeah.
This podcast has been sponsored by ProCal Lighting.